said, today we're going to speak about auditing as a tool for measuring and managing environmental improvement. And I'm going to use CUNY as the case study for how this can be done. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of our experiences with you. And I welcome any questions that you have at the end. So before we start talking about CUNY, I'd like to introduce the topic by focusing on measurement to begin with, because an audit is just a tool for measuring improvement and ultimately for measuring success of any activity that's being evaluated. So here you see a picture of course, Wayne Gretzky. And you'll have to excuse me, the picture that I chose was, being a New Yorker, the picture I chose was Wayne Gretzky in a Rangers uniform. He's famously quoted as saying, "Skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." And the reason that I think that that's a good quotation to start this talk off with is because it really is the essence of measuring for success. We'll try to answer a few questions during the course of this webinar. Why is measurement important? And of course, the answer is because it allows us to track improvement. If you're not measuring, you don't know whether you are whether you're heading in the right direction or not. Why is auditing, which is the key topic for today, an effective management tool? And the answer that we'll see is because it provides a benchmark for measuring success, and which is a fundamental tool for understanding progress. And why are case studies helpful? Because they help us by enabling us to share lessons learned. We all make mistakes in the measurement process, in the auditing process, and if we share our insights and the lessons that we learned from these mistakes, it's beneficial to everyone. So let's take a look at measurement per se. It's a picture of Peter Drucker, the world-renowned expert in management systems. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that was, of course, the title of the article that you'll see, one of the articles that this talk is based on, which is called "What Gets Measured Gets Done." So why is measurement important? It allows us to link management and policy actions to outcomes. We'll define these terms momentarily. What problems are we trying to solve? How do we think our solution will work to solve these problems? And how do we measure success? Because people are going to want to know, what kind of objective data do we have that tells us that we are making progress? Measurement helps us identify pertinent management information. The four key components are inputs, for example, staff time and effort, materials and supplies that go into producing a service. Process, sometimes we refer to it as a black box, but that really doesn't do it justice, because in most cases it's a clear chain of activities that goes into producing a product or a service. And the results, outputs and outcomes. Outputs are the quantity of volume of the service provided, and outcomes are the quality or effectiveness of the service. They answer the fundamental question, have we made progress in solving the problem? I have an example that I like to use in a presentation that my colleague Steve Cohen and I use at Columbia for one of our workshop presentations, and it is a picture of two world-renowned superstars, soccer superstars, Pele and Maradona. And there's an eternal question, an eternal debate, and it's not just in this case, it's in any sport and probably most activities in life. Who's the best, Pele or Maradona? So the easy way to avoid this question is to say, well, neither of them. We have different ideas, different suggestions, but just to use this as an example and to explain the difference between outputs and outcomes. Each of these superstars has an extraordinary track record. Their statistics for personal achievement are overwhelming, superhuman. But the real question, and those are considered outputs, the real question is, from an organizational standpoint, what have they done for their teams? And the outcomes can really be seen by the championships that they help their teams win, by the World Cups that they participated in and won. And so we can distinguish between outputs and outcomes by looking at those personal accomplishments versus the overall organizational achievements. Let's talk about measurement decisions and how we come up with these tools, and that will lead us into how we came up with our approach to auditing at the City University of New York. So first of all, we look at measurement system design. We have to review the system, as I mentioned before, the inputs and the processes and the outputs and the outcomes, and we design performance indicators. I have a little mnemonic or an acronym. We call it STAR. Those performance indicators have to be specific, trackable, attainable, and relevant. And the reason I have an NYPD police car up there is for two reasons. First of all, I picked an electric vehicle because we're talking about environmental auditing and sustainability. Second of all, because I want to give you an example of these STAR indicators. Anytime a police officer or a team go out in a police car, they log the mileage. So mileage is specific. Obviously, we know what mileage is and what it represents. It's trackable because we can just log it in, and we can continue to look at the log and see how many miles were logged on any given day. It's attainable for the same reason. All we have to do is look at the odometer, and if we know how to add and subtract, we can figure out how many miles were driven. And ultimately, relevant. Is it relevant? And of course, that's the ultimate question. It is relevant because we do want to be able to see that our police officers were driving an appropriate number of miles so that they can patrol the area of responsibility. But of course, that's where measurement is called into question. Relevant for what? Relevant for what outcome? For what purpose? And so there are also issues of validity and reliability. And I have two examples that I think everyone will understand. Validity is the degree to which an indicator accurately explains or predicts, such as SAT or other standardized tests. Do they correlate with future college success or not? And reliability, the degree to which an indicator consistently measures the outcome. So if, to use the same example, if you take SATs over and over without any intervening variable like a review course, do you get the same score? And those are tests for measurement system design. Now, a process. Here's where we get closer and closer to the audit issues that we'll be discussing ultimately. The process includes a number of key points. The data collection, so where's the data coming from? And in environmental audits, there are records. The surveys are really interviews with people. There are outstanding reports, and there are previous audits. We also do visual inspections. We have the campuses do self-assessments, and early on in the system, we had independent analysis as well. We also have to figure out how to compile and analyze the data, which is, after many years of auditing, is still an evolving process because we're always trying to figure out a way to do it better and more effectively. Then we have to figure out the reporting process. How often do we report? Who will be reporting? To whom will we be reporting? And ultimately, as you can see, the ubiquitous plan, do, check, act model on the side, we have to figure out what the feedback will be. When we evaluate when we evaluate a compliance program, ultimately there has to be a system for feedback, for sharing information, for acknowledging success, for improving on areas that needed improvement, and ultimately we use it to check ourselves to make sure that our audit program is working effectively. A third measurement decision is, should we use existing systems, or should we custom make them, or tailor make them to our own specific needs? On the left, you see a series of I would say off-the-shelf or existing measurement systems that are related to environmental programs. The earlier ones like Total Quality Environmental Management, the ASTM E1527 guidance, which had a Superfund orientation and has been revised several times. The ISO 14000 standard, which is an environmental management system, which focuses on compliance, pollution prevention, and continuous improvement. It's a performance evaluation component, ISO 14031, and more recent systems that we use, such as the LEAD program that we use for assessing energy efficiency and other sustainability metrics for our systems. And on the right, you see an example of custom-made or off-the-shelf, and in the top one, you can bake in whatever you like. On the bottom one, you can be sure that it will be the same for every peanut butter and jelly sandwich that you need to make, or every portion of French toast. A few cautionary words I'd like to share with you on environmental data, and there's an excellent piece from the Chemical Engineering Progress magazine that I like to share with my students, and I'll share some of the thoughts with you on measurement because, as I say, it's a constantly evolving process, and we have to always be thinking about what we can do better. So I'll just go through the list quickly to give you a sense of the types of, to give you a cautionary tale on putting together your environmental auditing system. So number one, it should be simple. It shouldn't require a lot of people. It shouldn't be that hard to develop. Number two, it should be useful for management decision making and relevant for the business operations. If it's going to be simple, people can read it and understand it, and we share it with management so that they have an understanding of where environmental auditing fits into their overall management of the campus, of the facilities, and it needs to be helpful to them rather than something that's just going to end up on a shelf. It's got to be understandable to a variety of audiences. The people involved in an audit range from chemistry professors who are running labs and research labs to the facilities personnel who are in the boiler room, to the president and the vice president of the campus. It's got to be cost effective because everything needs to be cost effective. It's got to be reproducible. When we look at an audit, we want to make sure that all of the audits for every college are following the same protocols, the same procedures. We try to stick to a consistent schedule. And so if we would go in and do it a second time, we would typically come up with the same results. And that's why they should be reproducible. They should be robust and non-perverse. That's a complicated way of saying that we should be looking at the right things. If hazardous waste disposal numbers are increasing, that's an indication of, could be an indication of several different things. They could either be increasing because we're doing a better job of tracking our hazardous waste and handling it properly, or it could be because we're generating too much hazardous waste and should be reducing reducing those numbers. It should be stackable along the supply chain. That's not always feasible in an audit program, and it should be protective of proprietary information. And that is true because even the EPA allows us to file certain regulatory filings in a manner that is protective of proprietary information. Let me give you an example that's unrelated to the environment, but I think is illustrative of how important these measurement tools are. And this is how the New York City Police Department measures its crime statistics so that it knows where crime is taking place and how it can focus its resources most effectively to reduce that crime. New York has famously reduced the number of murders in the city from close to 2,500, not quite that high, to approximately 300 in recent years. And the reason, or one of the reasons, there are many explanations for it, but one of the reasons is because the city has done an extraordinary job, the police department in particular, of focusing on data-driven policing. And that means that they, regardless of the decision-making process that was used previously, every crime is now carefully tracked and monitored throughout the city. You see a recent example. By the way, this is all public information. You can go online, and it's updated. It's updated regularly. And the graph that you see on the right is striking in how the number of murders in the city has declined. And the plot map on the top right shows us how the city has tracked murders and other crimes, and how it uses that data to make sure that it focuses its resources in those areas to minimize criminal activity. And ultimately, the results speak for themselves. CompStat has been used in many different enterprises, and I just wanted to share one with you, a CompStat-like program that was initiated in Maryland for Chesapeake Bay, and it is called Baystat, as in CompStat, Baystat. You get it, and you'll hear it in many different contexts. It's the Chesapeake Bay Health Index, and it's based on longitudinal water quality and biotic data, and it provides a scorecard of the bay, of all of its tributaries, and you can see that it's provided in very clear and self-explanatory terms. If your tributary it gets a poor grade, that means that you really need to step up the efforts to make sure that the pollution that's being discharged and other contaminants that are contributing to the overall quality or lack thereof of Chesapeake Bay are being addressed. I'd like to move now from general terms of measurement and measurement systems to the CUNY program. This article that you just see the front page of was published in 2005, and it was 2 years, as the title suggests, 2 years into the CUNY EPA audit agreement. What you're going to hear next is not a 2005 version of the audit program, but an update of this article that brings us through effectively 14 years of an auditing program. Now, let me just give you a little background on the university. As Mitch said at the beginning, it's the largest urban university in the United States. The map on the right is a map of New York City, and you can see where each of our campuses are located. All 24 are located within the boundaries of New York City, and there are 24 of them. We audit them on a 3-year cycle. There are 11 senior colleges. Of course, the senior colleges typically have more laboratories and other research facilities. There are 7 community colleges, all of which also have laboratories and some research, and there are 6 graduate schools. The system has 300 buildings, more than 300 buildings, with 26 million square feet of space. To give you an idea of what that means from a sustainability standpoint, it's approximately 1% of the New York City overall energy footprint. We have approximately 600,000 students, faculty, and staff. That doesn't mean that they're all there on the same day. It doesn't mean that all 600,000 are full-time students or employees, but ultimately that's the number of full and part-time and matriculated students, in fact, full-time and part-time staff. We have, just to give you an idea of scope, 1,600 laboratories throughout the system. The audit program, I'd like to say that it was something that we took the initiative on, and of course there were a variety of auditing programs and data collection programs for environmental quality at CUNY for many, many years. But this audit protocol, this audit regime started because EPA initiated a college and university audit and disclosure program. They argued, and I agree with the thesis, they argued that universities, which are in many cases small cities, because a campus can be a huge facility, they should set a standard of environmental leadership. Why? Because we at the university are training our future leaders, not just environmental leaders, but all of America's commercial and government leaders who have to understand that environmental quality is not something that's a good thing to have. It's a must for all future managers. And so EPA felt that way and took the initiative and insisted that campuses meet all regulatory requirements and set up the National College and University Initiative. Campuses were expected to be in full compliance with environmental requirements. Now, that might not sound too shocking because we all have to be in compliance with all laws. But I think the EPA felt that sometimes campuses took certain liberties because they have small quantities of many chemicals, because they're under the supervision of experienced scholars and professors. But we realized that there is a lot of work that has to be done to make sure that all of our systems are brought into compliance. And they offered us an option. They offered all colleges and universities an option of compliance in one of 2 ways. Either stand pat and use the existing systems that you have in place and wait for EPA to come and inspect and hope that your systems are adequate, or join in this initiative and voluntarily establish an audit system and disclose your findings to EPA. CUNY was one of the first public universities to opt for a voluntary disclosure, and I have to say that turned out to be a great idea because it allowed us to work out a very effective and what we think is fair, and I hope EPA felt it was fair or they wouldn't have signed it, a fair agreement that helped us focus not on what kind of compliance issues we might have had in the past, but how we can address them and move into the future to ensure full compliance. The audits that that all of the universities signed up for typically were 5-year programs. The final audit reports were disclosed to EPA twice a year. We were doing four campuses a year on average, and we would report them every 6 months. As a result, or as part of the agreement, we were able to avoid gravity-based and economic benefit fines Gravity-based fines are those that are most severe, and EPA incorporates severity into its inspection and fines and penalties, and also economic benefit fines. Of course, if you have an obligation to upgrade a system or to replace a system that's not in compliance, whatever that might be, and you don't do it, there are economic benefits because you didn't have to spend the money, and EPA takes that into account as well. Fines and penalties were waived as long as recurrence prevention measures were instituted. That's where environmental management systems come into play. They minimized interagency referrals, although in our case it wasn't really much of an issue because we're a public university, and most of the materials that we work with and most of our reports and our findings are publicly available, and the focus was on recurrence prevention. The ultimate goal was zero findings. Right? Now, in reality, that is a very, very difficult target to hit, but that's the one that we always focus on. The success of an audit is measured not only by the number of findings that it generates, but by how well it prepares the campus for the future. And that's what we were talking about before when we talked about outputs and outcomes. The outputs could be considered the findings that we come up with at every audit. The outcomes are how well these audits prepare the campus for a quality environmental future. The methods that we use include preparing. We're always doing that through training, through inspections. We track and follow up. When we find something or something comes up in an audit, we go back shortly thereafter to make sure that it has been remedied. We develop management systems, as I mentioned. I'll talk a little bit more about it. Our environmental management system is a derivative of ISO 14000. We haven't registered it as an ISO system, but we do like the way the ISO system encourages us to focus on what we consider to be the important aspects of environmental quality, and we communicate and train constantly. Once the audit is over, and sometimes even while it's underway, the corrective action phase begins. On the right, you see a picture of chemicals in a flammables cabinet, and so if we notice something during the audit, of course we're going to document it. That's how an audit works. But typically by the time we note it, it's in the process of being fixed. And that's great. That's what we like to see. And the trick is making sure that it gets fixed and stays fixed. We look for internal assessments of the audit findings. Sometimes they involve there's some sampling or analysis that has to be undertaken. There are a lot of labeling and record keeping and training documentation that has to be maintained, and we always remind them that if people don't sign in for the mandatory training, it's not quite fair to say that they didn't get trained, but if you can't document it, you can't prove that it ever happened. And that's why documentation of regulatory status is so important. And ultimately, improvement targets always have to be set. We want to make sure that what we're doing is always geared towards continuous improvement. At a time when colleges and universities must compete for students and resources, it's remarkable that there's so much cooperation in the environmental health and safety arena. I found this to be true even when I was in private industry. It's one area that everyone understands. Is highly technical. It's very complex, and there is an extensive level of cooperation where you might not expect it in other spheres. I'll give you a few examples of how we do it. At CUNY, we have an Environmental Health and Safety Council that meets once a month and has been doing so for 14 years. We meet with the second Thursday of the month, every month, and we have for an hour and a half, and we have half of the meeting focused on organizational issues and committee reports, and we have half of the meeting of where we bring someone in who is an expert in some aspect of environmental health and safety compliance, and we have them teach us something that we can bring back to our campuses and hopefully apply to our continuous improvement process. We created the New York Campus Environmental Resource. It's referred to as NICER. We started off with half a dozen or 10 colleges, universities, and teaching hospitals in the city. Our invitation list or our listserv has more than 100 institutions in it now, and we meet quarterly to share information on regulatory developments, changes in best management practices, and we do it in a similar way. Typically, we will discuss recent audit findings or experiences and regulatory visits and the like, and then we'll have somebody come in and train us all on something that's relevant to everyone. CUNY participates in the State Environmental Health and Safety Association, which is not only consisting of State University of New York schools, but also many private institutions throughout the state. They meet 4 times a year, but more importantly, there's a listserv where anyone can post any question, and someone in New York State who's a participant will have had experience with that question and hopefully will have a good answer to share. We work with the Environmental Protection Agency. Initially, there was a bit of a adversarial relationship, but after a short period of time, even EPA was attending some of our NICER meetings and even invited us to EPA headquarters in Region 2 in Lower Manhattan and hosted one of our NICER meetings, and the regional administrator addressed all of the participants. We have city and state regulatory agencies that we deal with all the time. The DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Health Department, that's both the State Health Department and the City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the Fire Department, which you see a representative of on the picture to the right, OSHA for worker safety. Here in New Jersey, it's referred to as POSH because it's Public Employee Occupational Safety and Health that addresses public institutions. In New York State, it's PESH because there's a state OSHA and in the Department of Labor and the Public Employee Safety and Health Unit, also in the Department of Labor, but that's who we work with. Emergency management, both at the city and state level, and police, both at the city and state level. And just to highlight that picture on the right, the fire department comes and visits our campuses all the time. We want to make sure that if something bad happens, that the fire department knows where our labs are, not just where the main administrative building is that has the primary address for the campus. We want to make sure that they're familiar with our campus. It's important for them because of the safety of the firefighters who are going to be entering there, and it's important for us because it gets them there quicker. They know what to expect, and they have a greater familiarity with everything about the campus. Campus before an audit is like study hall during final exams week. Everybody is running around the campus. The lab chemical storage and labeling is being addressed. Hazardous wastes are being, the storage areas are being inspected. Air emissions, the permits, community right to know. Everybody's checking to make sure that all of the documentation is up to date. Petroleum bulk storage. All of our campuses have tanks for their fleet fueling, for their heating systems, for emergency power, and they're constantly, as you can see in the picture on the right, they're constantly being inspected and upgraded. Asbestos and lead are still issues on many of our campuses. We do a lot of research, and so there are radioactive sources on our campuses that have to be in compliance. There are universal waste and electronic waste issues that are slightly different from our hazardous waste storage issues. People don't think of computers as e-waste, and so they might just put them outside of their office or in a corridor somewhere, and that's not the way electronic waste has to be handled. Similarly with universal waste, like light bulbs. I'll show you some examples of both momentarily. Select agents under the Patriot Act. We have obligations to make sure that we are providing special security related to these kinds of agents that, of course, are part of research at large universities, and so wherever we have them, we have to make sure that we are in full compliance. Fire safety, worker safety, we talked about, and of course, training and documentation. I'd like to spend the next few minutes just giving you some a little tour of CUNY, with some hopefully interesting sightseeing pictures in the background of New York City. The first one that you can see, well, all of these were taken at our campuses. As you can see, the beautiful New York City skyline. You could figure by the orientation of the buildings and which buildings you're looking at, if you're familiar with the city, where you're looking from. I'll just give it away. It's from Queens, from Long Island City. And one of the things that you see in this picture is a reminder of the industrial and commercial history of New York City. And that history affects the environmental issues that we have to address on our campuses and that everyone in the city has to address. And so we are mindful of this, and I thought it would be a good place to start the discussion. Our campuses are all over the city, and they're all very different. On the top left, we have a converted department store that serves as our graduate center. On the top right is is a beautiful modern building that we added at Queensborough Community College. And at the bottom, you see the real juxtaposition of how complicated our work can be sometimes, because we have brand new LEED certified buildings on the left. This is at Lehman College, that are connected to or adjacent to beautiful historical buildings that need different types. Each of these need different types of environmental auditing focus. This is a picture of one of our facilities, one of our campuses. It's, on the left is what it looked like after one of the buildings at the World Trade Center collapsed and tore a huge swath out of the side of the building during the 9/11 attack. And this was one of our campus buildings for the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and it had to be removed. And part of the reason is environmental, and that's why we have to make sure that we are always being diligent to make sure that we understand what the environmental risks are in our buildings. And the one on the right is the replacement of the one on the left, and we're very lucky that we now have this facility added to our campus. On the upper left is the older science building at the City College of New York, and you can see that one of the issues there was energy and other environmental considerations. And on the right is what it looks like today, with a completely new envelope It's had a lot of the environmental components replaced and upgraded, and we're constantly doing that throughout our system. This is also on City College. It's two of our newest and most impressive architecturally, most impressive buildings. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because one of the things that we can do when we're building a building from scratch is we can incorporate environmental systems into it that are more difficult to incorporate if you have to upgrade an older building and bring it and bring those systems into an existing building. It's not just labs. It's about every aspect of the building. Our auditors go into basements and crawl spaces and mechanical rooms and boiler rooms, and this is an example of what one looks like. Of course, this has they don't all look like this, where everything is properly labeled and color coded and the floor is nicely swept, but we try to make sure that they are all in good condition and all well maintained, because it's not just the parts of the campus that you can see that are important. It's the parts that you can't see as well. There are air emissions on all of our campuses. This is a stack at Queens College, and we have sensors. It's hard to see them in this picture because they're way up at the top, but we are constantly measuring our air emissions, and we record them, and we incorporate this data into our audit program and in our environmental management system data. I mentioned universal waste a little while ago. This is an example of what we do with our fluorescent lamps or our fluorescent light bulbs, and because if they're not stored properly, there's a potential that they'll break. There are hazardous chemicals that are in them, and we want to make sure. And if they break, they could be treated as hazardous waste. So the regulations require us to store them carefully, and this is something that we check on an ongoing basis. Labs don't always look like this, but that's what they should look like when they're being audited, and if they look like that when they're being audited, we know that they can look like that all the time. We try to make sure that they do. Of course, we have many new buildings. I'm not going to say that this is an easy lab to audit because there are no chemicals in it yet, but I'm going to tell you that this is the newer labs are all designed with environmental health and safety at the core of the design process. I just wanted to share this one picture because it's got the flyer that was put up before we did an audit at one of our campuses. This is at one of the early audits in our program, and there was a sign that they posted certainly throughout the science areas, reminding everybody that the audit is coming. I like to think that it was a positive in almost every case, but I'm also certain that it made people a little bit nervous knowing that they were preparing for an audit. And I wanted to show you a picture of our campuses. They don't, just as I started by showing you that New York City is an old industrial city, this is an old industrial facility on the top right that has been converted for one of our campuses, and it has all of the issues that you would expect in a developed, heavily used area of New York City. And this is the once all the cleanup was done, this is the beautiful results. It's our new science building at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn. And ultimately, a successful audit is a learning experience. It's a learning experience in the field, as you can see on the left, and it's a learning experience in the audit, in the office. Meetings are an inevitable part of management, and auditing and the auditing process and environmental health and safety is no different. It's something that needs to be done, but if you do it in a way that's positive and constructive and involves everyone in an inclusive manner, you get a lot done. After years of auditing, CUNY is still developing effective management tools. You would think that we've got it down pat after doing this for so long, but I have to say it's a continuous improvement process for all the campuses and for us who are doing the audits. Why is measurement so challenging? Well, we found out that success in this arena is measured not in profitability, but in cost avoidance for the most part. Right? Environmental issues are not, unless that's your business, environmental issues are not profit centers. They are something that is part of promoting the core activity of the organization. And so we focus on how we're avoiding problems with our environmental compliance, but that's harder to document than something that's positive. It's hard, if not impossible, to prove a negative. Comparing findings is misleading. Right? If one campus has 10 findings and another campus has 5, it's not fair or valuable to say that the one with 10 is doing worse. It's important to differentiate between the kinds of findings, where they are, what their impact can be. Fines and penalties are inconsistent. Sometimes we'll get inspections and we'll realize that we're getting fined for certain things that we didn't anticipate because we learned from previous inspections, and inspectors are different, and each situation is different. So it's hard to rely on consistency in that arena. And while everybody understands how important environmental health and safety is, the intricacies of it are just that. It's very technical, and very few people understand it. We need indicators that will foster a commitment to compliance as well as a fundamental change in the environmental culture of the university. Integrating environmental health indicators into general management metrics is what we all hope for, so that the leadership of every campus understands how important and how important these data are and how they play into the overall success of the campus. And we also include environmental health and safety criteria as performance indicators for senior officers. As soon as someone knows that they're being evaluated for environmental quality, you can go back to the title of the original paper: what gets measured gets done. And so it's something that we found was very helpful. And it's not in a punitive way at all. It's a way to help people understand the importance of the issue. And ultimately, everything needs to be data driven. One of my favorite management theorists, the people that to whom total quality management and other statistical quality control initiatives are attributed to, is W. Edwards Deming, and I love this line. He's not only a good management theorist, but he has a sense of humor. In God we trust, all others must bring data. To go beyond auditing, just to bring us to the end of our discussion, I'd like to speak about our environmental management system for a moment. I mentioned it was ISO 14000 based. ISO 14000, as all ISO systems, is constantly being revised and reevaluated and reassessed, and so we look at all of the updated components and updated versions, and our environmental management system is also constantly being reassessed and upgraded. There is a major CUNY sustainability initiative. It's started during Mayor Bloomberg's tenure as mayor of New York. Created the College and University Initiative. It was an offshoot of Plan YC, and his special challenge to universities was the 30 and 10 challenge, where they would accomplish a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 10 years, which was 2007 to 2017. And I have to commend Mayor de Blasio for not missing a beat and continuing with this this focus on greenhouse gas emission reduction and the overall quality of New York City's environment through his One NYC plan, which has an 80 by 50 metric, which you can see the cover of the report to the right. I would encourage anybody to log on to nyc.gov and take a look at it. Risk management and emergency preparedness are part of our efforts. And they are not incorporated in our environmental health and safety audits, but we are looking to develop similar types of measurement systems to make sure that we are incorporating risk and emergency preparedness into our daily activities. And ultimately, our outcome that we hoped for, and I like to think that we've been successful in many respects, is changing organizational culture. Today, there's no question at CUNY that we are obligated to be in full compliance. How we get there, what resources will be invested in it, those are all ongoing questions. But the fundamental issue of whether this is important and whether this is critical to the university's future is not in question. Just a few takeaway thoughts, and then I will take some questions. We can only assess continual improvement, the sine qua non of good management, if we have good metrics. That's what auditing is all about. It gives us the tools to do that. Audits and other performance management systems are essential for measuring success in a consistent manner. We do them every 3 years, and the most important thing that we look at is not did you fail to get to zero findings, but how did you improve on the previous audit? And ultimately, the case study method of looking at ours and sharing information with other campuses allows us to share lessons learned so that we don't have to repeat our mistakes or mistakes of others. To close, I'd like to paraphrase Gary Player, the world-renowned golfer, who is often quoted as saying, "The harder we work, the luckier we get." I think that applies to anything in life. It certainly applies to environmental compliance and to the auditing process. And I hope this has been helpful to you. I want to thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please type a question in the question box. And I gave you one article before, and this is another article that was recently published in 2015 and updates the earlier article and covers many of the items that I mentioned today in the webinar. Thank you. Okay. So here is a question. How is compliance ensured between audits? And that's a very good question. As I mentioned, the audits are done on a triennial basis. That means we do, probably can figure out this math. If there are 24 campuses and we do it every 3 years, we do 4 campuses a year. We also do some surprise audits, or we don't like to call them surprise audits because nobody likes surprises. We call them unscheduled audits because when EPA comes to a campus or another regulatory agency, they don't call us in advance and say, how would next Thursday be? They show up when they're ready to inspect. And so we try to make sure that everyone is prepared for a surprise audit, a surprise inspection. That's why we have an unscheduled audit. We do one every semester. And so that's one way that we ensure compliance between audits. The other way is we're constantly visiting the campuses, walking around, checking labs. We go to meetings at campuses all the time. The environmental compliance concerns are not happening at our headquarters office. It's happening in the laboratories. It's happening at the facilities. And so we need to be out there on a regular basis. And that's how we accomplish this between audits. I see another question. Did EPA insist on including health and safety compliance in the audits? And the answer is yes and no, because many EPA programs have health and safety aspects to them. And so EPA does, when they do an inspection, they certainly share their findings if they see that we're out of compliance in a health and safety arena, or suspect that we are. But they didn't insist on it during the initial audit and disclosure agreement. It's something that we realized was very important as we were going through the first round of audits, that we need to be able to document our OSHA, or in our case, PESH requirements as well. And so we would go into the mechanical areas, and we would go into the shops, and we would make sure that health and safety issues were being addressed as well. And we did it initially in an informal manner and ultimately incorporated it fully into our audit program. Next question is, do you include best management practices in the audit, or is it just compliance? The answer to that is the audits are primarily compliance audits, but not every good practice is incorporated in the regulations. And so we try to make sure that we are constantly learning from other universities and other institutions so that we can apply best management practices even when they're not required. We do this in, for example, in our laboratories with our lab safety manual that focuses not only on regulatory requirements but also on good management practices. I see another question. When you are inspected by regulatory agencies, how do the audits come into play? Well, of course, as I mentioned, EPA had a requirement that we put in non-recurrence measures so that we don't have the same, we don't make the same mistakes that we made before, that we don't have consistent non-compliance areas of non-compliance. And so our audits help us make sure that that doesn't happen. And I have to say that I always check our audits to see what EPA is finding or another regulatory agency is finding, to make sure that we are covering the same ground, and if we aren't, we make sure that we incorporate that into future audits. I see I have time for one quick last question, so I will just address that one. Are you planning to add risk management component to the audits? And the answer to that is we already do have risk management components because the regulations require a certain amount of risk management to be built into our compliance efforts. So I would say the answer is yes, it's already in there for our existing environmental health and safety efforts, but risk management is a very broad field. It encompasses almost every aspect of the enterprise, not just environmental health and safety. And as I mentioned during the webinar, we're still trying to develop the right kinds of comprehensive tools to help us measure our improvement in that arena. With that, I've run out of time, and I just want to thank you again for listening to this presentation. I want to thank Rutgers School of Public Health for hosting it, and Mitch in particular for his efforts in helping me prepare this, and I hope that this has been helpful for you, and once again, thank you so much for listening.